Okay, in this video we're going to talk about line boring. I think this deserves a dedicated video because there's a couple different schools of thought on this. And so primarily two main options that people do. The first one is called bore by opening, and the second one is called bore required hose, basically like putting like 5 hose per shelf instead of the full run of hose. So with what we've set up so far, we actually don't even have shelf hose yet. So I want to show you how you can set up the two options and kind of show you the difference. That way you can make a decision on which way you want to start with. So I'm going to do bore by opening first. So just like all the last couple videos, I'm going to go to room, cabinet, and modify for this room. And this time I'm going to go to the operations tab. There's not a whole lot in here, but line boring is one thing that we need to do here. So right now it's set on no boring hose, which is not what we want. So let's do bore by opening first. Bore by opening and bore all is very similar. Most times when people do want full runs, they use bore by opening, not bore all. And then like I said, the bore required is where you pick a certain number of hose per shelf. So let's do bore by opening, and it's going to ask us a couple questions. Do we want to reference from the top or the bottom? I want to come from the bottom. Let's say I want 4 inches off the bottom. And minimum distance of last hoe, let's just do 4 inches there too. And you can equalize the distance, but I want it to be exactly 4 on the bottom. Fine. And I'm just, making some decisions as I go. Obviously you can make it whatever you need. Okay, diameter of the boring hoe. Now I want to be careful here because I know this is 5 millimeters, but if I type that in, I'm in inches right now. And I can't click down here. So in the construction wizard, you'll see this little button that you can actually swap between inches and millimeters. So I'll put 5 there. Now if I go back to inches, you see it converts it. You gotta be careful with the rounding, but if you type in 5 millimeters in this view, it's going to be perfect. The only reason it showed the rounded version is because of my setting. So we switch to millimeters, type in 5, and we're good to go. On the depth, same thing. I'm gonna switch to millimeters and go 10. And now we got from the front, and then the next question will be from the back. I'm just gonna do 1.5 inches from the front. And be careful with this question because you don't want to reference them both from the front, or most people don't. You'd want to reference the front line of hose from the front, and the back line of hose would come from the back. There might be some situations where that's different, but for most people, reference the first line from the front and the back line from the back. And I'm just going to make them the same. And then spacing, I'm going to go 32 millimeters. And I'm not going to spend time on the middle hose, but you can see those questions there. Okay, so now we have our line of hose, and you can see that my 1.5 inch question is actually referring to the finished end. So I kind of wish it would be from the inside of the back, but you just have to kind of compensate for that. So really, because my nailer and back combined are 1 inch, really I should have made the back distance like 2.5, which I'll just go do that real quick, just to show you the difference there. So we'll fly to that last question and go 2.5. And you can also customize those settings at the cabinet level. So for example, if you happen to remove the back, you also have access to the boring section inside of the cabinet, and you can move the front and back setback. And again, I know we're talking just global settings so far, but we're gonna get a whole lot more into editing a cabinet. Okay, so that's the bore by opening. And that works pretty well, and I see that pretty common, especially with people who sell to dealers, and I think it's more predictable. If you're a custom builder, you kind of can talk with the homeowner and figure out what goes in a cabinet, and you can kind of plan the openings. But what happens a lot of times, if you just do the 5 hose, somebody will want to move a shelf where there's not hose. But that's up to you on what you decide. Both options are viable. So now let's talk about how do we do the bore required hose, because there's one thing we have to do different for this. For bore by opening, we can do it all in the construction method. But when I switch to bore required hose, I get one question and that's it. And if we go look, there's nothing here yet. And so I have to toggle that in the construction method, but what I also have to do is I have to go back and create a connection specifically for my bore per shelf. So let's save this. Close my job and save it, and we're going to go to connections. And when I was creating connections, I did create a line bore with 5 hose, and there's not a whole lot of questions here to ask how much side clearance. It says bore required, and it says how many, and then you can control the front and back spacing. And this time I'm going to put 1.5 inches and 1.5 inches, and let's put 32 millimeters. middle lines, we don't want that. 32mm spacing, and that's good. And now, like I said, it doesn't have to be 5 hose. Like I could copy this and make a 7 hoe or a 13 hoe or whatever I want to make. So I would copy that, and I just simply go update the quantity to 7. And I like to get the description cleaned up. That way when I sort it, everything's perfect. So again, we can create multiple connections for these different setups. But let's go back into our job, and I'll show you how to apply that connection so we can actually see that bore per shelf option. Back in the construction method, remember it's not in operations because we already chose everything that we need to choose here. We go to connections, right, because it's a connection, and we go to adjustable shelves. And so how does your adjustable shelf and finished end connect? Let's do 5 hose, skin end, unfinished end. I a lot of times just leave skin ends on none because I personally don't use them a whole lot, but if you're using skin, obviously you would answer that question. Sub end, I'm just gonna pick the same one here, and you can see that you could obviously pick different connections here as needed. And then we'd also want to put it on our partitions and our dividers. Okay, now we should start seeing our hose. And so here's what I'm talking about when I say bore per shelf. And I really like this option if you can find a way to deal with the extra space, because overall it just feels smarter. You know, the bore by opening was like attached to the end. So like when you said reference from back, like we saw, it didn't really know where the shelf was. It was just in reference to the finished end or the unfinished end. The other thing I really like about this method is if you happen to decrease a shelf, the hose will follow it. On bore by opening, the line bore would still be out here at the front. So, like I said, bore by opening is nice because you get that full run. And bore per shelf just feels smarter if you're a custom shop. So you kind of weigh the pros and cons and figure out what works for you. And like I said, some people just increase the number of hose so that they can essentially get a continuous set of run, you know, because if I would do more like 7 or 9 or 11 hose, I really wouldn't even have a gap anyways in most situations. So that's the 2 main options on the line bore, and I'm going to leave mine on bore per shelf because that's my personal favorite, but again, each shop has different needs. So that's all for this video.